the received wisdom today is that we live in a different world in which fake news, disinformation, misinformation through the social media has created a serious crisis for democracy, for nation states. It has provoked significant levels of conflict. It has generated hate speech, which has been very destructive for inter-community relations. In short, it has become a real threat to democracy. The reason why this argument is made is that representative democracy is dependent for its good functioning on a number of issues. The first is that representative democracy is different from direct democracy because people elect representatives who act on their behalf. So because you are representing citizens, there has to be a relationship of communication and information between the citizens who have elected the persons involved and the representative. That's why public opinion is an essential pillar in liberal democracy. People who exercise power on behalf of people try to invest all their energies to understand at each point, what do people want? What are people saying? So that those demands of citizens, those opinions of citizens can be translated into public policy. For policy output to reflect the demands of citizens, information has to be clear, it has to be accurate, and if information gets distorted, gets falsified, then what's happening is that you are eroding the content of liberal democracy because policy outputs are no longer representing demands and desires of citizens, and that the falsification process has therefore created a crisis in the system itself. In that case, the arguments we all make today is that the impact of the social media has created a new world in which democracy has been weakened, in which information is continuously tainted, it is also controlled, and it is used to distort outcomes of electoral processes. Of course, two examples have emerged at the international level of how this distortion could be extremely threatening to democratic processes. One example is the election of the American president, Donald Trump, who told lies throughout the campaigns, who distorted information, who deceived the people, and got rewarded by being elected. The implication, therefore, is that electoral democracy in the United States has been compromised to a significant level because had people not been deceived, then the outcome might have been different. The second example that is usually brought out is that of Brexit, where the campaign for Brexit was organized around a lie, which is that each week 350 million pounds are paid to Brussels without any benefit for the UK, and that by leaving the European Union, that a massive amount of revenues would be retained and used for the development of the United Kingdom rather than other European countries. Immediately that information arose, all the fact checkers in the United Kingdom pointed out it was a lie, that it wasn't true, there was no basis in facts. But the current British Prime Minister stuck to his line, spread it wider, deepens people's belief in the lie, and today is rewarded by being the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I start with these two countries because these are countries, the United States and the United Kingdom, that have a very long history of liberal democracy, that have a highly educated citizenry, that have institutions that had matured over the centuries. And in spite of that, you could have massive disinformation affecting electoral outcomes and therefore affecting the integrity of not just the electoral system itself, but also of democracy. The broad understanding that has emerged from these types of trends in the contemporary world is that the social media in particular has a lot of responsibility for this type of distortion of democratic processes and the accompanying difficulties related to the effect of hate speech in promoting division and conflict in society. My reflection today is that maybe the real problem isn't the social media. It will seem to me that the real problem might be the way in which certain specific techniques are able to essentially disempower the capacity of human beings to engage in critical thinking. And that process is what we should be focusing on as we engage in this reflection on disinformation and misinformation. One of the most respected books on the rise of the Nazi regime in Germany was that of Hannah Arendt, 1951, on the origins of totalitarianism. The argument she makes in the book is that the rise to power of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s was crafted very carefully by playing on the difference between fact and fiction and being able to construct serious and deep confusion on what is true and what is false. And in creating that confusion between the true and the false is the creation of a narrative that defines an enemy of the people. That enemy of the people, in the case of Hitler, the Jews, is then attributed a lot of evil content, the plot they have to destroy society, the strategy they have successfully developed to control world finance, the concentration of all powers in their hands, and the use of that power to do damage, to destroy the people. It is the construction of these narratives that question the reality that people see around them, distorts that reality, and simplifies the reality of a people into a simple expression that you have one enemy, I've identified and discovered that enemy, and then if we therefore eliminate that enemy, all problems are solved. It is therefore a technique that has been developed essentially under the Nazi regime, and what we are witnessing today is essentially the reproduction of those processes, and the only fault you can attribute to the social media is that its technology makes it easier to promote those narratives, and in addition gives people the impression that they are participating constructively in the construction of the narratives by being actors in identifying the enemy, focusing attention on eliminating the enemy, and thereby creating the basis for good. The essence of this technique is to generate strong emotions in people, to appeal to what makes them frightened, what makes them afraid, what makes them concerned about their future, and by so doing, create a connection in the minds of people that if the question of that enemy is not addressed, then their future is in jeopardy. For it to succeed, there has to be sufficient investment to destroy one quality that's extremely important in democracies. That is trust. Because democracy is representative and people act on behalf of citizens who are themselves not exercising power, trust is an extremely important element in democratic processes. But when you create these narratives about the enemies who have penetrated all institutions, who run the media, who are the leading professors in the university, who run the banks, then people withdraw trust from the system because they fall into the trap of believing all the institutions have been targeted, infiltrated, and used to create evil rather than to create good. Central to the destruction of trust is the denial of truth. Germans will tell you one of the words Hitler used the most was Lügenpresse, which means fake news. We are very unfair to Trump in saying he invented that. He just learned the technique. Why then does the social media become an important mechanism for amplifying this capacity to destroy trust, to create hate, and to focus attention on eliminating the enemy? The reason it does that more effectively than previous technologies is its capacity to incorporate a large number of community members in its processes. In Nigeria today, 40 million of us are on WhatsApp every day, creating media content. 25 million are on Facebook, creating media content. 7 million on Twitter, creating media content. So the news that's circulating appears not to come from authority, but from ordinary citizens. And this gives it a lot of force, the force of conviction that if government lies all the time and deceives all the time, the pastor, my pastor I received this WhatsApp message from, this schoolmate I received the WhatsApp message from, are people I know who will not spread misinformation at will. And of course, for most of the people who use social media and spread misinformation, they do so believing that information to be true. And that is known to people who receive that information, that these people will not tell us something that's not true, gives that fake information a lot of credibility. It becomes believable. The reality, however, about the social media is that people are acting in an atomized way. It's individuals engaging on the basis of things they have seen and received. But that information is very highly centralized and controlled by the technology companies who today have responsibility for distributing a lot of the content we see. The technology companies, 3 or 4 of them, have been able to develop very sophisticated algorithms that are designed not to disinform people, not to tell lies, but are designed to make profit for them. Facebook is not pro-democracy or anti-democracy. The same with all of them. They are pro-profit. How do you make profit by circulating media content. The way you do it, and this was discovered through many serious studies, is by generating high levels of emotion. What are people afraid of? Push that story, they'll get angry. They will rush for that information that's generated either their anger or fear or concern. What the technology companies discovered, that once you generate information that pushes emotion of people, people flock to that site, and that site is able to generate resources. So these technology companies are in that sense neutral in terms of what they do. They are just good capitalists. But the problem is, the stories that tend to generate the highest emotions are successful when the content is graphic, when the content is frightening, and often if you inject things that are fake but extremely graphic, it generates movement and therefore generates profit. So that's the situation in which we find ourselves in the contemporary world, in which a few, very few companies control most of the information flow in the world. They control that information flow in a way that generates strong passion and emotion in people, and that creates profits for them. It's quite interesting reviewing the way in which these companies have impacted on social and political processes, the way in which they themselves get frightened at how gullible people were. You remember the owner of Facebook, when revelations started emerging, you say, no, I'm just an IT person. You can't attribute who wins the American presidency to ordinary me. I'm just allowing people to distribute their issues to their friends. And the question of friends then becomes very important. These companies today have detailed files on each and every one of us and most members of our communities. They push us to like. By liking, they identify what we want and what we do not want. And that places you into a category. What they then do is to group those who like the same things. And by grouping them, they are able to now discuss these contents they see in a manner where each of them reinforces the belief of the others. When you are on Facebook and you have 5,000 friends, the reality of your conversation is that you are conversing with 25 to 30 people with almost identical views. But then, what you say is also seen by a few people who intensely dislike your views or opinions, and that becomes the enemy. So they attack you, you attack them back, and those of you with the same positions reinforce your belief in yourselves and your positions, and clarify in your minds that the other is indeed a real enemy. And this process, induced by the technology, developed out of very intensive research and reinforced by the fact that for the first time in world history, one company has files on 2 billion human beings, knows their friends, their likes and their dislikes, creates a new position, a new situation, in the world in which the capacity to do harm is extremely high. I don't really want to go into all the ways in which this process were manifested in the 2019 elections, because I've seen the program and I've seen that for the 2 days you'll be going into these details. I'll just illustrate the argument by the one example I always give when I talk about these issues, and that's the famous herdsmen. These evil Fulani people who are not even Nigerians, who came in 1804 and conquered the people in northern Nigeria, tried to conquer the rest of the country, was stopped by the brave people of the Middle Belt, and in their anger, and now that they have a president of theirs, are coming to continue the war to take over the land of the people of the Middle Belt, the good Christian people, confronting total destruction from mad Muslim pastoralists who have the support of the state to carry out their evil intentions. That's the narrative that was constructed. And many professors I've seen my colleagues from Ahmadu Bello University, for instance, on Channel TV, articulating this narrative. This is a fellow I know. He knows what he is saying is not a reflection of history or reality, but it serves a purpose, and it is constructed in a way to weaponize political objectives. So my Benue story. In January last year, I went with the Nigerian Bar Association to Benue following the New Year massacres that occurred. You remember 1st, 2nd January 2018. On arrival in Makurdi, we visited the governor, and the governor was fuming and waving this piece of paper, which was distributed to us. It was allegedly a press release by a certain organization known as the Fulani Nationality Movement, which stated in very clear terms its objectives. One, to complete the initiative started with the jihad to Islamize the people of Benue, to take over their land and rule them. All those complex issues are then replaced by a single narrative. The Muslim jihadists are here to take over our land. And everybody believes it. and everybody then repeats that narrative. And it's quite interesting the way in which people lose their capacity for critical thinking. And that's what this process does. And just fall for whatever story. Because when this Funam thing came in January, remember in June, the crisis in Plateau again resurfaced. And that same press release was circulated. And I compared them, I have the copies. They removed Tiv and Idoma in one and replaced it with Birom. And they just changed a few words, and again, that generated more killings. What this process does is that it uses existing problems, because there are real problems around pastoralism, for instance. There has been 40 years of clashing and killing between farmers and pastoralists. The then head of the NBA, A.B. Mahmoud, was the Attorney General in Kano in the 1990s. And when he was Attorney General, most of the deaths that he handled in Kano were due to clashes between farmers and herders. So I'm not making the argument that these problems don't exist, but what happens is that they get oversimplified and above all become weaponized for political objective. And the specific issue of Benue, and that's why it's a good example, January 2018, the general consensus was that it was impossible for Otom to win re-election in Benue. Benue is a state where people are so dependent on salaries, civil servants and teachers. He had refused to pay salaries. He had basically stolen all the revenues coming into the state and was the most unpopular person in the state. By weaponizing this story, it became possible for him to regain his popularity as a defender of the good Christian people of Benue and to win re-election. My sense, therefore, is that as we look at disinformation, as we look at misinformation, and we look at the impact of hate narratives in our society, it is really important to have beneath our mind always the logic of these processes. Let me conclude by making the point that at the level of science, the way in which you do this weaponization has been really perfected. A number of companies, Cambridge Analytica, famous for that, Bell's Pottinger. You recall the way in which the Gupta brothers in South Africa, for example, when they were being accused of state capture, that is corruption, were able to hire Bell Pottinger from London to come and turn the narrative from corruption by these brothers to the Boers are still in control of South African land and don't waste our time with petty corruption when we know who the real enemies are. So these techniques have been highly developed by these companies. But what's really important is that the techniques have now been appropriated by very large numbers of people. Bell Pottinger, that worked for the Gupta brothers, was paid to do a video on Buhari in 2015. A very small video, and you remember it came up in the House of Commons public hearing on the way in which these technology companies spread falsehood. And it was in that hearing that we found out that they've developed these techniques specifically for the Nigerian 2015 elections campaign. And it was those techniques that were amplified for the 2019 elections. And I think the Center for Democracy and Development has documented a lot of this type of content that has arisen. The final point I said I'll make is about the nature of electoral politics in Nigeria and the way in which that politics makes the use of these processes much easier than it is in a lot of societies. From the colonial days, Nigerian politics has been played on the basis of mobilization along ethnic and religious and regional lines. This means long before we come to this phase of technology and the social media, narratives exist that define the enemy, that define the other, and there are tons of narratives about how your own group has suffered enormously from the damage done by the enemy, the other. And therefore, since these narratives exist in people's minds, and because these images have already, in a subliminal manner, infiltrated into people's consciousness, then manipulating them becomes much easier. What the 1-minute video by Bell Pottinger did on the Buhari story is just 1 minute, but it shows somebody cutting off the heads of babies. It shows women who appear to be Christian being imposed a hijab. It shows a large number of corpses. So those images, when people see it, they don't forget. It remains in the mind. So when 3 years later, you see a press release that says the jihadists are coming to kill you, your children, and take your land, you make that mental association of narratives you've already been exposed for, and it becomes real. It becomes a question of your existence as a human being, and then you become ready to kill the other so that you may live. Unfortunately, you will also not live in that circumstance. Thank you.